He threw the divorce papers across the mahogany desk and laughed in her face. "You think you're a real doctor, Maya? You're a nurse. You take orders. I save lives." Dr. James Carter thought he just executed the perfect separation, divorcing his mediocre wife to marry his brilliant surgical fellow and secure his legacy as America's greatest cardiac surgeon. He thought Maya Reeves was walking away with nothing but her nursing degree and student loan debt, but he didn't check the one thing that mattered more than the marriage certificate. He didn't know that the assisting she did in every surgery wasn't just handing him instruments, it was saving the patient while his hands shook. When the hospital's surgical review board analyzed his first solo operation after the divorce, James didn't just lose his composure, he lost everything he thought made him a god. This is the story of the hands that healed and the ego that killed. The conference room at St. Catherine's Medical Center was kept at exactly 68 degrees, but today it felt like a morgue. Maya Reeves sat in the stiff-backed chair across from her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, her hands folded on the table. She wore her navy blue nursing scrubs, the ones she'd worn for 12 years, with her hospital ID badge still clipped to her chest. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face, free of makeup, showed the exhaustion of someone who had just finished a double shift. Across from her sat Dr. James Carter, chief of cardiac surgery at St. Catherine's, the man who had been on the cover of Time magazine, the surgeon who had a 99% success rate, the doctor senators flew to when their hearts were failing. He wore a custom-tailored suit that cost more than Maya made in 3 months, and his salt and pepper hair was styled to perfection. He looked like exactly what he was, a man at the top of the world, untouchable and unstoppable. "Finally," James said, checking his Rolex, "I have a surgery in 2 hours, a senator's triple bypass. Real work, Maya, not checking vitals and changing bedpans." He slid the divorce papers toward her. "Sign it. We both know this marriage has been dead longer than some of my patients." Sitting next to James was his attorney, Richard Moss, a shark in an expensive suit. "Mrs. Carter, or rather Miss Reeves, since you'll be returning to your maiden name, the settlement is straightforward. You receive the condo in Queens, your vehicle, and $75,000. In exchange, you waive all claims to Dr. Carter's practice, his medical patents, his speaking fees, and his future earnings." $75,000, he scoffed. "That's generous considering you contributed nothing to my success. While I was pioneering the Carter valve technique, you were what? Adjusting IV drips? Fluffing pillows?" Maya's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. "You know what your problem is, Maya?" He leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "You never had the killer instinct. You barely passed your boards. You failed the MCAT twice. You couldn't cut it as a real doctor, so you settled for being a nurse. And that's fine. Someone has to do the grunt work, but don't pretend we're equals." "I never said we were equals," Maya said quietly. "Damn right we're not," James laughed. "I have 14 medical patents, Maya, 14 techniques that bear my name. The Carter valve technique, the Carter bypass method, the Carter stent procedure. Hospitals pay me 6 figures just to come teach their surgeons. I've saved over 3,000 lives. What have you done? Held retractors?" Richard cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should focus on—" "No, she needs to hear this," James interrupted. "Maya, I'm divorcing you because you're an anchor. Dr. Simmons understands excellence. She's a surgical fellow. She's published in the New England Journal of Medicine. She's been offered positions at Johns Hopkins and the Mayo Clinic. She's my equal. You," he gestured dismissively, "you're a participation trophy in scrubs." Maya looked down at the papers, her hands, usually so steady, the hands that had held scalpels, tied sutures, and stopped bleeding when seconds mattered, were trembling slightly. "There's just one thing," Maya said softly. James sighed dramatically. "What now?" "The surgeries, the ones scheduled for next week. Who's assisting?" James frowned. "What does that matter? I'll have Dr. Simmons assist. She's more qualified than you ever were." "And the week after?" Maya pressed. Maya, I don't need you, James said slowly, as if speaking to a child. I never needed you. You were there because hospital policy requires a surgical nurse in the OR. Any competent nurse can do what you did. You're replaceable. Maya picked up the pen. I know. She signed the first page, then the second, then the third. James snatched the papers the moment she finished. Richard, file these today. I want this finalized before my TED Talk next month. I'm not standing on that stage as a married man when the world knows I'm meant to be with someone exceptional. Maya walked up, picking up her worn purse. She walked to the door, her footsteps quiet on the expensive carpet. Maya, James called out, his voice softer now, almost pitying. For what it's worth, I hope you find someone at your level, maybe a paramedic or a physician's assistant, someone who doesn't make you feel like you're not enough. Maya turned back, and for the first time in the meeting, she looked directly into his eyes. I never felt like I wasn't enough, James. You did. She walked out, leaving him confused by her words, but not concerned. He was Dr. James Carter. He was a genius. He was untouchable. The celebration dinner was at 11 Madison Park, the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan, where a single meal cost more than Maya made in a week. James sat across from Dr. Victoria Simmons, his surgical fellow, his mistress of 8 months, and soon to be his new wife. Victoria was everything Maya wasn't. Tall, blonde, confident, with degrees from Stanford and Harvard. She wore a red dress that cost more than a used car and held her champagne glass like she'd been born with it in her hand. To freedom, Victoria said, clinking her glass against his, and to finally being with someone who understands what it means to be exceptional. James agreed enthusiastically, taking a long sip of the $400 bottle of Dom Perignon. God, I should have done this years ago. Do you know she actually asked me about next week's surgeries, like I can't operate without her holding my hand? Maya never understood that I'm the surgeon. I make the decisions. I save the lives. She just followed my orders. Victoria laughed, a sharp musical sound that turned heads at nearby tables. Nurses always think they're more important than they are. They don't understand that we're the ones with the real knowledge, the real skill. They're just there to do what we tell them. James's phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Papers filed. You're officially a free man. Congratulations. He showed Victoria the message, and she squealed with delight, loud enough that the sommelier glanced over disapprovingly. We should celebrate properly, Victoria purred, running her hand up his arm. Your penthouse? Our penthouse, James corrected, with a satisfied smile. I already had Maya's things moved to storage. I don't want any reminders of that chapter of my life. It's time for a fresh start with someone who actually deserves to stand next to me. What James didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd never paid attention, was that at that exact moment, Maya was sitting in the office of Dr. Helen Chen, chief of surgery at St. Catherine's Medical Center, signing her resignation letter. Are you absolutely certain about this? Dr. Chen asked, her expression troubled as she reviewed the document. You've been the finest surgical nurse this hospital has ever had. Your instincts are impeccable, your knowledge rivals that of our residents, and your success rate in the OR is... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Maya, you're irreplaceable. Maya's smile was sad but resolute. I'm very certain, Helen. I can't do it anymore. I can't stand in that operating room and watch him take credit for saves that weren't his. I can't be invisible anymore. Dr. Chen leaned back in her chair, studying Maya's face. I've been in this business for 32 years. I've seen a lot of surgeons come and go. Some are legitimately brilliant, some are competent, and some, she paused again, more deliberately this time, some are only as good as the team around them, the very best team. Maya understood what Dr. Chen couldn't say directly. Hospital politics, legal liability, professional courtesy, they all prevented the chief from speaking the truth out loud. But the message was clear. What will you do now? Dr. Chen asked quietly. Maya stood up, slinging her worn purse over her shoulder. I'm going to sleep through the night for the first time in 12 years, and then I'm going to figure out who Maya Reeves is when she's not saving someone else's reputation. She walked out of St. Catherine's Medical Center that night and didn't look back at the building where she'd spent over a decade of her life, where she'd saved hundreds of lives, where she'd made a famous surgeon out of a man with shaking hands. The first surgery without Maya was scheduled for Monday morning at 7 a.m. James woke up feeling energized, confident, ready to prove to himself and everyone else that he had never needed Maya at all. He arrived at the hospital at 6 a.m., an hour early, and found Victoria already in the surgical prep room, looking nervous despite her confident facade. Ready to make history? James asked, scrubbing his hands with the thoroughness that had been drilled into him in medical school. Always, Victoria replied, but there was a tremor in her voice that James, in his arrogance, completely missed. The patient was Robert Torres, a 54-year-old high school principal with 3 critically blocked arteries and a wife of 30 years sitting terrified in the waiting room. It was supposed to be routine. James had performed this exact procedure, the Carter bypass method, over 200 times. The OR was filled with the usual team: Dr. Patricia Moore, the anesthesiologist, 2 surgical nurses James barely knew, named Jennifer and Susan, a third-year resident named Dr. Kumar taking notes, and Victoria across from him, ready to assist. James felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as he entered the operating room, the feeling of absolute power, of holding life and death in his hands. "Scalpel," James commanded, his voice steady and authoritative, the voice that had been featured in documentaries and medical podcasts. Jennifer handed it to him, and he made the first incision, clean and precise, exactly as he'd done countless times before. "Retractor," he ordered, and the instrument was placed in his hand. He opened the chest cavity, exposing the heart, that incredible muscle, still beating, still fighting to keep Robert Torres alive, despite the blockages trying to kill him. So far, everything was textbook perfect. "Clamp," James said, reaching for the first blocked artery. His hand was steady as he positioned the instrument. But then, something happened that had never happened before. Something that sent a cold spike of fear through his chest. His hand started to shake. Not a lot at first, just a slight tremor, barely noticeable. But in cardiac surgery, where a millimeter is the difference between saving a life and severing an artery, barely noticeable might as well be an earthquake. "James?" Victoria said, her voice uncertain. "I'm fine," he snapped, trying to steady his hand through sheer force of will. He repositioned and tried again, but the tremor got worse, spreading from his fingers up through his wrist. The monitors started beeping, a sound that every surgeon dreads. "Doctor, we're losing him," Patricia said sharply from her position at the head of the table. "Blood pressure is dropping, 90/60 and falling." James stared at the exposed heart, at the arteries he needed to bypass, at the procedure he had supposedly mastered years ago. And suddenly, terrifyingly, he couldn't remember what came next. His mind, usually so sharp and quick, was completely blank. It was like trying to remember a dream after waking. He knew there was something there, something important, but he couldn't grasp it. "Dr. Carter, what's the next step?" Victoria asked, and there was panic creeping into her voice now. She was a surgical fellow, brilliant in her own right, but she'd never performed this procedure as lead surgeon. She was there to assist, to learn, to follow his instructions. James looked at his shaking hands, at the open chest cavity, at the beeping monitors. I need... His throat was closing up. Sweat was dripping down his forehead into his eyes, despite the cool temperature of the OR. "We're losing him," Patricia shouted. "BP is 70/40. We need to do something now." The resident, Dr. Kumar, was staring at James with wide, horrified eyes. The nurses stood frozen, instruments in hand, waiting for orders that weren't coming. And James realized, in that moment of absolute terror, that he genuinely didn't know what to do. For 12 years, his hands had shaken like this. From the very first surgery he'd ever performed, they had trembled with nerves, with pressure, with the weight of holding someone's life in his palms. And every single time, without fail, Maya had been standing right next to him, her voice calm and steady in his ear, guiding him through the moments when his mind went blank and his hands betrayed him. "Steady pressure on the superior vena cava, doctor," she would murmur, so quietly that only he could hear. "Now the bypass graft. Attach it to the left anterior descending artery. Remember your angles." Her hands would hover near his, not touching, but ready, always ready to correct if he started to slip. She knew every step of every procedure he'd ever pioneered. She'd taught him the techniques he'd later patented under his own name. And now she was gone. "Doctor," Patricia's voice cut through his panic. "We've got ventricular fibrillation. He's coding." The monitor's steady beep dissolved into a chaotic, screaming alarm. Robert Torres was dying on the table, and Dr. James Carter, genius surgeon, Time magazine cover star, creator of 14 patented techniques, stood paralyzed with a scalpel in his shaking hand, unable to save him. "Someone call for backup," Victoria screamed. "Get another surgeon in here now." The OR door burst open, and Dr. Marcus Webb, another cardiac surgeon, rushed in, still pulling on his gloves. He took one look at the situation, the coding patient, the frozen lead surgeon, the panicking team, and immediately took control. "Step aside," Marcus commanded, pushing James out of the way. James stumbled backward, watching as Dr. Webb's steady, confident hands did what his could not. 20 minutes later, Robert Torres was stable, his chest closed, his heart beating in a normal rhythm. But James Carter was sitting on the floor of the scrub room, his head in his hands, his expensive surgical gown soaked with sweat, knowing that his entire world had just collapsed because the one person who had made him look like a god had walked away, and she had every right to. The emergency meeting of the surgical review board was called for 6 p.m. that same day, and James sat in the conference room where he'd signed his divorce papers just 4 days ago. Except this time he was on the other side of the table, facing a panel of 5 senior doctors who looked at him with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed contempt. Dr. Helen Chen sat at the center, flanked by Dr. Marcus Webb, who had saved Robert Torres's life, Dr. Patricia Moore, the anesthesiologist who had witnessed James's meltdown, and 2 other senior surgeons James barely knew. "Dr. Carter," Helen began, her voice professionally neutral but her eyes cold, "we're here to discuss what happened in OR 3 this morning, a routine bypass surgery that nearly became a fatality because the lead surgeon froze." James's jaw clenched. "I had a momentary lapse. It happens to everyone. The patient is fine. Dr. Webb stabilized him. There's no harm, no foul." "No harm?" Marcus Webb leaned forward, his voice tight with anger. "James, that man coded on the table. His heart stopped. If I hadn't been in the building, if I'd been 30 seconds slower getting to that OR, Robert Torres would be dead right now. His wife would be a widow. His 3 kids would be without a father. You call that no harm?" James felt sweat prickling at the back of his neck despite the aggressive air conditioning. "I've performed over 3,000 successful surgeries. One bad day doesn't erase that record." "That's what we need to discuss," Helen said, pulling out a tablet and placing it on the table. "Dr. Moore brought something to my attention after this morning's incident, something concerning." Patricia Moore spoke up, her voice careful and measured. "After the surgery, I was reviewing the OR footage. We record everything for training and liability purposes. I noticed something unusual about Dr. Carter's performance, so I went back and looked at footage from previous surgeries over the past year. What I found was disturbing." She tapped the tablet and turned it so James could see the screen. It showed OR footage from 6 months ago, one of James's surgeries. He watched himself make an incision, and then the camera angle shifted to show Maya standing beside him. The footage had audio. James heard his own voice, confident and commanding, "Clamp." But then, so quietly that it was almost inaudible, Maya's voice, "Superior vena cava, doctor, steady pressure. Watch the angle on the left ventricle." On screen, James's hands adjusted, following her whispered instructions exactly. The surgery continued, and every few minutes, the same pattern emerged. James would reach for an instrument, his hands would hesitate or tremble slightly, and Maya's voice would guide him through the next step so quietly that it sounded like she was simply describing what he was already doing. "This is one surgery," Patricia said, swiping to another video. "Here's another from 8 months ago." The same pattern, Maya's quiet voice, James's shaking hands, her guidance disguised as observation. And another from a year ago. Again, the same thing. "I went back further," Patricia continued, her voice growing harder. 2 years, 5 years, 8 years. Every single surgery you've performed at this hospital, James, has the same pattern. Your hands shake, you hesitate, and Nurse Reeves guides you through every critical step. The room was silent, except for the hum of the ventilation system. James felt like he was falling, like the floor had disappeared beneath his chair. "That's not," he started, but his voice cracked. "That's not what that is. She was assisting. That's what surgical nurses do." "Assisting is handing you instruments," Marcus Webb said coldly. "What she was doing was performing surgery through you. Your hands were just the tools she used because hospital policy won't let a nurse be the lead surgeon, no matter how qualified." Helen Chen pulled out a thick file folder. "After Dr. Moore showed me this footage, I did some investigating of my own. I pulled your medical school records, James, your surgical rotation evaluations." She opened the folder and began reading. "Third-year clinical rotation, cardiac surgery. Student shows theoretical knowledge, but significant manual dexterity issues. Hands shake under pressure. Recommend additional practice before certification." She flipped a page. "Fourth-year evaluation. James Carter continues to struggle with fine motor control during high-stress procedures. Surgical skills rated below average for his cohort." She looked up at him. "You barely passed your surgical boards, James. You were ranked in the bottom third of your medical school class for practical skills. So I asked myself, how does a surgeon with documented tremor issues and poor manual dexterity become one of the most successful cardiac surgeons in the country?" She pulled out another document. "Then I found this, your marriage license. You married Maya Reeves 12 years ago, just 3 months after you started your residency here at St. Catherine's, and according to the surgical logs, your success rate dramatically improved the moment she was assigned as your surgical nurse." James felt his throat closing. "This is circumstantial. You're making connections that aren't there." "Am I?" Helen pulled out more papers. "These are the 14 medical patents you hold, James, the techniques that bear your name. I had our legal team pull the original patent applications." She spread them across the table. "Every single one of these patents was filed jointly by you and Maya Reeves. But the final approved patents list only your name. Maya's name was removed from all of them." James's face went pale. She agreed to that. She said she didn't want the attention. She wanted me to have the credit." "Did she?" Helen asked quietly. "Or did you convince her it was better for the family, better for your career, better for both of you if the famous surgeon was just you? Did you tell her that nobody would respect a surgical technique developed by a nurse, so it was better if you took the credit and shared the financial benefits?" James couldn't answer because she was right. He remembered those conversations now, remembered how he'd framed it as protecting Maya from the spotlight, from the pressure, from the scrutiny. But really, he'd wanted the glory for himself. He'd wanted to be the genius, the innovator, the star. And Maya, who loved him, who believed in him, had stepped into the shadows and let him shine. "Dr. Carter," Helen said, and her voice was no longer neutral. It was the voice of a judge delivering a sentence. "Effective immediately, you are suspended from all surgical duties pending a full investigation. You will not enter an operating room. You will not treat patients. Your privileges at this hospital are revoked until we determine the full extent of the situation." "You can't do this," James said, his voice rising in panic. "I'm the chief of cardiac surgery. I have patients scheduled. I have a waiting list of people who need me." "No," Marcus Webb said flatly. "You have a waiting list of people who need Maya Reeves, and she doesn't work here anymore." The meeting ended, and James walked out of the conference room in a daze. He pulled out his phone and saw that he had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. He opened his phone and his stomach dropped. The first message was from a reporter at the New York Times. "Dr. Carter, we've received information about irregularities in your surgical record. Would you like to comment before we publish?" The second was from a colleague at Johns Hopkins. "James, what the hell is going on? I'm hearing rumors that you've been suspended." The third was from his publicist. "Call me immediately. TMZ is running a story about you, and there's footage." James clicked on the TMZ link with shaking hands. The headline read, "Miracle Surgeon or Miracle Nurse? Shocking footage reveals famous doctor's secret." The article included clips from the OR footage, not from St. Catherine's internal files, but from a documentary that had been filmed in the hospital 2 years ago, footage that was public record. Someone had gone through it frame by frame and isolated every moment where Maya's voice could be heard guiding James through procedures. The video had already been viewed 2 million times. The comment section was brutal. "I knew something was off about him. He always seemed so nervous in interviews. This is why we need to respect nurses more. They're literally saving lives, and doctors take all the credit. My father had surgery with Dr. Carter 3 years ago. Was it actually the nurse who saved his life? Sue him. Every patient should sue for fraud." James's phone rang. It was Victoria. He answered, desperate for support, for someone to tell him this would be okay. "Victoria, thank God. Can you come over? I can't be associated with you," Victoria said, her voice icy and distant, nothing like the warm, seductive tone from dinner 4 nights ago. "My fellowship is at risk. My reputation is at risk. I'm putting out a statement saying I had no knowledge of your arrangement with your ex-wife." Arrangement? James felt anger cutting through his panic. "Victoria, you were there this morning. You saw what happened. I had an off day. Everyone has off days." "James, I went back and watched footage of the surgeries I assisted on with you, the ones where Maya wasn't there. Do you know what I realized? Every time you've operated without her, you've struggled. Every time. I just thought you were tired or distracted, but now I know the truth. You're not a surgeon, James. You're a puppet, and she was the one pulling the strings." She hung up. James stood in the empty hospital corridor, his phone clutched in his hand, surrounded by the institution that had made him famous, and realized that Victoria was right. He wasn't a miracle surgeon. He had never been a miracle surgeon. He was just a man with shaking hands who had been lucky enough to marry someone extraordinary, and stupid enough to throw her away. 14 months later, James Carter sat in a cramped studio apartment in Newark, New Jersey, staring at a laptop screen that showed a live stream of the annual American College of Surgeons conference, the same conference where he had once been the keynote speaker, the same stage where he had received standing ovations and awards. Now he watched from a $400 a month apartment that smelled like mildew and the Chinese takeout from 3 days ago, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt with a coffee stain on the front. His once perfectly styled hair now long and greasy, his face covered with a patchy beard that made him look 10 years older than he was. The medical board investigation had taken 4 months and had been devastating in its thoroughness. They'd reviewed every surgery James had ever performed, interviewed every nurse and resident who had worked with him, and analyzed every patent he'd claimed as his own. The final report was 53 pages long and concluded that Dr. James Carter had committed systematic fraud through the exploitation of a skilled surgical nurse who performed the critical aspects of procedures while Dr. Carter took credit. His medical license had been permanently revoked. Not suspended, revoked. He would never practice medicine again. The lawsuit from Robert Torres, the patient who had nearly died, was settled out of court for $4.2 million, money James didn't have, forcing him to declare bankruptcy. The penthouse was gone, sold to pay legal fees. Victoria had married another surgeon 6 months ago and had moved to Seattle, and James had seen the wedding photos on Instagram before he'd finally deleted all his social media accounts because the comments were too brutal to bear. His book deal, a memoir about his surgical innovations that was supposed to earn him $2 million, had been canceled, with the publisher demanding the return of his $200,000 advance. He tried to get work as a medical consultant, but no one would hire the most famous fraud in modern medicine. He'd tried to rebrand himself as a motivational speaker about overcoming failure, but the lecture agencies just laughed. Finally, desperate and broke, he'd taken a job as a customer service representative for a medical supply company, answering phones 8 hours a day, being yelled at by doctors and nurses who sometimes recognized his voice and asked, "Wait, aren't you that fraud surgeon?" He made $18 an hour. On the laptop screen, the conference host was introducing the keynote speaker. "It is my profound honor to introduce a surgeon who has revolutionized cardiac care, who has trained a new generation of medical professionals, and who has shown us that true genius often goes unrecognized until someone has the courage to step into the light. Please welcome Dr. Maya Reeves." The audience erupted in applause as Maya walked onto the stage, and James felt his chest constrict with an emotion so complex he couldn't name it. Grief, regret, pride, shame, all tangled together into something that made it hard to breathe. She wore a white doctor's coat over an elegant navy dress, and her hair was down, framing her face in soft waves. She looked confident, radiant, absolutely nothing like the exhausted nurse in wrinkled scrubs who had signed divorce papers in that conference room. She looked like someone who had been buried alive and clawed her way back to the surface, stronger for having survived. "Thank you," Maya said, her voice steady and clear, no longer the quiet whisper James had gotten used to dismissing. "I'm honored to be here. 14 months ago, I was a surgical nurse. I'd been a nurse for 12 years, and I knew I was good at it. But I'd accepted that being good at something doesn't always mean getting credit for it. I'd accepted that my role was to support, to assist, to stand in the shadows while someone else stood in the spotlight." She paused, and the room was silent, thousands of doctors and medical professionals hanging on her every word. But then, something happened that forced me to make a choice. I could continue being invisible, or I could walk away and discover who I was when I stopped making someone else look brilliant. I chose to walk away. And what I discovered was that I wasn't just good at my job, I was exceptional at it. I had skills that I'd never been allowed to demonstrate because hospital policy and outdated hierarchies said that a nurse, no matter how talented, couldn't be a surgeon. Maya clicked a remote, and the screen behind her showed surgical footage. "This is from a procedure I performed 3 months ago at Boston General. After I left St. Catherine's, I enrolled in an accelerated medical degree program for experienced healthcare professionals. I completed in 18 months what usually takes 4 years because I already knew how to do the work. I just needed the credentials that said I was allowed to do it. I'm now a licensed cardiac surgeon, and this footage shows the Reeves valve technique, a new procedure I developed that reduces cardiac surgery recovery time by 40%. The audience broke into applause, but Maya held up her hand. "I didn't invent this technique in the last year. I developed it 8 years ago, but it was patented under someone else's name, someone who convinced me that the medical community wouldn't respect innovation from a nurse, that it was better for both of us if he took the credit and I stayed in the background. I believed him because I loved him, and because I'd been taught my entire career that nurses don't get to be heroes, we get to help heroes. But that's not true. We are the heroes. We just haven't been allowed to wear the cape." James watched her on the screen, and tears were streaming down his face, though he didn't remember when he'd started crying. "What happened to me was wrong," Maya continued, her voice growing stronger. "But it wasn't unique. There are thousands of nurses, physician assistants, and medical technicians who possess extraordinary skills, but are trapped by systems that don't recognize their potential. I'm using this platform to announce the Maya Reeves Foundation for Medical Education, funded by the settlement I received from my lawsuit. We'll provide scholarships and accelerated programs for experienced medical professionals who want to become doctors but can't afford the traditional path. We're going to change the system that keeps talented people in the shadows." The applause was thunderous now, a standing ovation that lasted 3 full minutes. James watched her through his tears, standing on that stage accepting the recognition she had always deserved. And he understood with devastating clarity that he hadn't just lost a wife when he divorced her, he'd lost the only person who had ever seen him clearly and loved him anyway. He'd lost the person who had covered for his weakness, protected his ego, and made him look like a god when he was barely competent. And he'd thrown her away because he'd believed his own lie, believed that he was the genius and she was just the assistant. His phone rang, a rare occurrence these days since almost no one called him anymore. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Hello?" "James, it's Helen Chen." He sat up straighter, suddenly alert. Helen Chen, the chief of surgery at St. Catherine's, the woman who had dismantled his career. "I'm calling because I thought you should know something. Robert Torres, the patient who nearly died during your last surgery, made a full recovery, and last week he came back to the hospital. He needed another procedure. Do you know who he requested as his surgeon?" James's throat was too tight to speak. "Maya," Helen continued. "He requested Maya specifically. He said he'd done his research and discovered that she was the one who had actually saved his life the first time, and he wanted her to do it again. She performed the surgery yesterday. It was flawless, not a single complication. He's already being discharged." James heard the message beneath her words. The patient you almost killed trusted the woman you destroyed, and she saved him. Again. "Why are you telling me this?" James managed to ask. "Because you've been calling the hospital administrator every month asking if there's any chance your license could be reinstated, any possibility of redemption. I wanted you to hear this directly from me. No, there is no redemption for what you did. You didn't just commit fraud, James. You stole 12 years of someone's life, 12 years of credit and recognition and advancement that belonged to her. You can't pay that back. You can't fix it. All you can do is live with it." She paused and her voice softened slightly. "But I also want to tell you that Maya doesn't hate you. I asked her once if she regretted the years she spent helping you, and do you know what she said? She said, 'I regret that he couldn't see that we could have been extraordinary together. Instead, he needed to be extraordinary alone, and it made him ordinary.'" Helen hung up without saying goodbye. James sat in his apartment, his laptop still streaming the conference, now showing Maya being interviewed by a panel of medical journalists. Someone asked her, "Do you have any message for the young nurses watching this, the ones who might be in situations where their talents aren't being recognized?" Maya thought for a moment, then smiled. "I would tell them that your value doesn't depend on someone else acknowledging it. Your skills are real, whether or not they're celebrated. And if you're in a situation where you're making someone else look brilliant while you stay invisible, ask yourself, am I afraid of stepping into the light because I might fail or because I might succeed?" She paused, looking directly at the camera, and James felt like she was looking at him through the screen. "And if you do decide to step into the light, don't be surprised when the person you were supporting can't stand without you. Their success was never really theirs. It was always yours. You were just letting them borrow it." The interview ended, and the live stream cut to footage of Maya in the OR at Boston General, her hands steady and sure as she performed a cardiac bypass, no one guiding her, no one whispering instructions, just her own skill and knowledge and years of experience finally being recognized. James closed his laptop. He sat in the silence of his studio apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of a life he'd built on someone else's foundation. His phone buzzed with a notification. His shift at the medical supply company started in an hour, and he needed to leave now if he wanted to catch the bus on time. He stood up, pulled on his jacket, and looked at himself in the small mirror by the door. The man staring back was a stranger, older, tired, defeated. Not the confident surgeon from magazine covers, not the genius who had graced TED Talk stages, just a man who had held greatness in his hands and had crushed it because he couldn't stand the idea that it wasn't his. James Carter walked out of his apartment into the gray Newark afternoon. Just another invisible person in a city full of them, finally understanding what Maya had tried to tell him in that conference room 14 months ago. She had never felt like she wasn't enough. He had, and he'd spent 12 years trying to fill that emptiness by stealing her light, only to discover that light couldn't be stolen, it could only be given. And once the gift was revoked, all that remained was the darkness he'd been hiding from all along. Somewhere in Boston, Dr. Maya Reeves was saving lives with steady hands and a clear conscience, finally visible, finally recognized, finally free. And somewhere in Newark, James Carter was answering phones and apologizing to strangers, learning what it meant to be ordinary, learning what it meant to live without the grace of someone extraordinary making you look like more than you were. It was perfect justice, cold and absolute and deserved. The surgeon who had stolen credit for thousands of lives saved would spend the rest of his life knowing that he couldn't save even one on his own. And the nurse who had been invisible for 12 years was now the brightest star in the medical field, her name on techniques that would save countless more lives. Her story inspiring a generation of people who had been told to stay small and had decided to become magnificent instead. That was the difference between them in the end. Maya had always had the skill, she just needed the courage to claim it. James had always had the ego, he just never had the talent to back it up. One of them learned to stand in the light. The other learned that shadows are cold and lonely and permanent when you've burned every bridge that could lead you back to the sun. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of the story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.